Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring training, by which I mean the kind you do in the office, whether online or in person. And not just any training. We're going to look at training that's often so bad, just the name of it will put you off. But bear with me if the phrase compliance training has you feeling queasy, because what I'm exploring here is a solution to that very thing. If you've ever had to deliver or suffer bad compliance training, then you'll want to listen to this episode. Those of you in compliance can listen and hear from someone who thinks there's a way we can do a better job at delivering it. And if you're someone that endures the kind of compliance training you wouldn't even want to inflict on your worst enemy, then listen and tell your compliance team that there's a better way to do things. Because my guest Travis Waugh has written a book called Fully Compliant. He's a learning and development specialist who's turned his hand to compliance training. In his book, he highlights how we can deliver what is often the most irrelevant seeming training in a manner that engages the audience. Rest assured that I wouldn't be inviting him onto the podcast if I didn't think the book was fabulous and Travis wasn't an engaging individual. He's probably the last person you'd expect to write a book on compliance training. And that's the whole point. In our discussion, we explore how he came to be interested in compliance training and what prompted him to write the book. And of course, we explore the world's largest ever compliance exercise, COVID-19, to see what we can learn from it. If your organization does compliance training and you think it could be better, listen to what Travis has to say and then make sure that those who are responsible for it in your organization know about it. Because like me, Travis is on a mission to change things. So with that said, let's hear from the man himself. Travis, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm an avid reader of your newsletter over the years, so I'm excited to be talking to you.
Awesome. Well, look, just to kickstart things, can you give the listeners a little bit of an idea of who you are and your background and how you kind of came to write the book that you've written?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Travis Waugh, and I started working in education really a long time ago as a teacher in Japan. So I studied English and philosophy, which is a really direct route to unemployment for a lot of people. And when I graduated from school, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. And I had a friend whose older sister had taught English in Japan. So I applied and I got a job teaching not Japanese students, but Japanese professionals. So the people that wanted to improve their business English. And I taught at this little mall in the middle of rural Japan. And it was a lot of fun for a year. And I won't tell you my whole background, but what that allowed is when I moved back to the States, the contract expired after a year. I just wanted a job. I wanted any job. And American Electric Power was a big employer in Columbus where I was. And they had contracts out they needed a bunch of people to travel around to power plants around America and teach them how to use this document retention system. So it was an IT trainer job. And at that time, you didn't need a lot of expertise to become an IT trainer. And they just said that anybody with teaching experience could apply. So I applied on the back of my 1 year of Japanese business experience, and I got this job. So for 3 years, I was traveling around doing this IT training. And I think the fortuitous part was I happened to be sitting on a team of people who designed the e-learning for American Electric Power. And I said I majored in English and philosophy. My focus was film, so I was always kind of secretly hoped I would become a filmmaker.
Don't we all, right?
Yeah, right. Which I also, on the other hand, I like to have a paycheck. So I was finding that was a difficult balance to strike. I felt like I really found my people on this e-learning team. They needed some help. They had a lot of demand. So I picked up the tools they were using quickly because they were like the video editing tools I'd used. So I created a couple of courses to help them. And over the time I was at American Electric Power, I became more and more of an e-learning person. And I've been lucky ever since to have jobs that I was always on training teams, usually spending some percentage of my time in the classroom and some percentage of my time on e-learning. And over the years, that e-learning became more and more compliance training. That's basically what people were asking us to build was compliance training. So, my initial audience when I started thinking about this was other trainers like me, instructional designers who know how to teach, know how to engage an audience, and then are being given this compliance content that can be quite hard to make engaging, And
right.
I found, sadly, a lot of training teams sort of make the compromise of holding their nose and basically just shoving in all this content that they were given because they can't even imagine a way to make it useful or engaging. So it ends up being, a hour of legal content. And I think over the years, it started to eat at me more. And it's one of those things where when we all kind of realize that something isn't helping, you sort of have to ask, why are we all still doing it? Right? So that's maybe more detail than you want, but it led to me. I used to apply to speak at training conferences because I always worked in higher education, and the only way they would give you any funding for travel is if you were speaking. Otherwise, I would have just happily gone to attend and listen to other people talk. And one year, I'd already done some topics that I personally found more interesting, like using humor in education and some other stuff. But I'd used those ideas already. So I thought, well, maybe this year I'll talk about compliance training, because we just built a compliance course that I thought was better than what we usually had built. And my manager made fun of me. She actually said, "You're picking the worst subject ever. No one's going to attend this session." But it was well attended, and it was by far, of all those passionate subjects I spoke on, maybe I got a couple of emails afterwards. The compliance, I did one 45-minute talk, and it's led to just a lot of conversations. It led to opportunities to write. I did follow-up magazines for the organization that put on the conference, and eventually the book, Fully Compliant, and conversations with folks like you. So I'm really grateful. And now I'm in more of a dedicated compliance role for the first time. I just started 6 months ago. I'm the manager of compliance training, policy, and communication at Tech Data. So luckily, I still am really comfortable with 1/3 of my job, and I'm learning really fast about the other 2/3.
What is the point in taking a job if you can do it all? I say, right? We need to stretch ourselves. So I think that's a perfectly acceptable reason for jumping into a role. And look, before we were recording, I mean, I said that I was kind of initially surprised by your background, because I saw that you had a fabulous job title that I'd never heard of before, which was instructional technologist. And I was like, I love this thing. So I kind of in my mind had just gone, here's an IT guy, right, who has made the leap into compliance. But of course, you've nicely articulated this thing that you started out as the the teacher, right, the instructor. And as anybody who has been to Japan knows, that is I've been there about 25 times. Every time I go to Japan, it blows my mind somehow. And I sort of, there's always little aspects of it. So that's an interesting piece. And then you pivot into that piece. And the bit that I think is really interesting is you're involved in preparing this content. And it's that bit that you pick up and just go, there's a better way we could do this. And I think it's really interesting that you're sort of responsible for the delivery vessel. Yeah. But it's the content that you're delivering that you jump into.
Yeah. So maybe it might be an interesting message for your audience, because your audience, I think, is more dedicated compliance professionals for the most part. Instructional designers wear a lot of different hats based on the scope of a project. So, if you're the subject matter expert, what you probably will find is you might think that the trainer or the instructional designer you're working with only does one kind of thing, but they're probably reacting to whatever they think it is you want them to do. So I feel like the scale of projects runs from, I think in a perfect world, we would love to live in a space where we don't start with content. We start with a meeting with a subject matter expert where we talk to them about what really needs to change. What pain points are you experiencing? Why do you want this training? Who is your audience? Let me tell some stories about your audience and make sure I really understand them. And then we take that back to the lab, and the writer in me wants to turn that into some kind of engaging short experience, maybe a traditional tutorial, or maybe a website, maybe an app, it could be anything. And then, I only learned the technology piece because I had to, because we didn't have budget to hire somebody else. So I really think of myself more as a storyteller who learned to use a few tools. But then, that's how I think it could work in a perfect world. And we can help you make sure we're evaluating it and reinforcing it. But, in a lot of projects, frankly, I've worked on in my career, what we're given is 30 slides of content, and somebody says, will you figure out how to put this in this system and tell me when somebody takes it? And, sure, we can do that too. But, I think it's a more satisfying job when we can help really craft.
Right. And that depiction, is I think anybody who's worked in an organization that has had to do compliance training. And my sense is you will agree with me that the compliance branding is possibly the worst thing to hit that function ever, because it sets you off in a world that it's not positive, right? No one sits there and you get an email with the word compliance in it, you're not excited. You get invited to a compliance training, and it's kind of like your worst nightmare at school, where you're dragged into that subject you hate with a teacher you can't stand, and you just got to get through this thing, right? So And so what I think is interesting here is that you've taken something that is traditionally terribly executed, and it's not a big secret that it's terribly executed. And what you've done is evolved something that is kind of said, let's take this thing head on, and we must be able to do better. And it's amazing because if you're starting, on the one hand, it's rich pickings, right? Because it's a very low bar. On the other hand, it's one hell of a challenge.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. I mean, a lot of what's in the book is about rebranding. Like the word, you're right, the word compliance is basically this shorthand for because I said so. And nobody likes to say because I said so.
Right. Which doesn't work when you're a kid, right?
No.
When an adult sort of says, because I told you to, right?
Yeah.
That they're out of it, they're out of rationale and excuses, and it's the last vestige of kind of authority.
Yeah.
So if it doesn't work as a kid, it's sure as hell not going to work as an adult.
No, there's no way to say it in a nice way. Like, hey, could you come over here for an hour and comply with something for me, please? Like, it sounds terrible. So that's the first step we do. I mean, I always had a slide. I taught for a while. I had a course for ATD that was the essentials of compliance training for other instructional designers like me. And the first thing I said was, no matter how difficult this content matter is, if you can't make any improvements at all, and it's still 30 slides of boring content, you can still improve it by changing the frame of that 30 slides of content. And that's not just the name, but if you change the name from Mandatory State of Georgia PPE Training 2019 to A Scientist's Guide to Living in the Lab, like that's just immediately sounds a bit more interesting.
Right.
We can still tell the regulators, oh yeah, this is our PPE course, but there's no reason we have to package it and give it to our learners as a PPE course. And then of course, hopefully it's more than just the title. It's everything the learner sees suddenly feels like, oh, this first story feels relevant to me. Oh, the way they talk through this inventory seems interesting to me. Maybe we never even have to use the acronym PPE in the course at all. That would be my dream.
Right, and I find it really interesting when you talk in those terms, because it is inherently lazy, the traditional approach, which is sort of, here's some dull content that we kind of have to foist on this population, and our key objective here is to say that we've done it, right? We can cover our backsides. Everybody has done this compulsory training, and then we can move on. And it's kind of, if you had a teacher that did that, it's the equivalent of sort of teaching to the syllabus and having zero engagement with the pupils. They would score very poorly in terms of any kind of assessment of their teaching ability, right? And so we've all been to school, so we all know this. And yet somehow this idea that because you're in a corporate environment and you have to do this thing, that we can somehow get away with really low quality, piss poor experience training. And it's not even training. It's just sort of, it's dull. It's the worst kind of dull lecturing in many cases. I find it fascinating that this has been allowed to persist for so long. Yeah.
I mean, I think to some extent it's self-perpetuating. I've had a lot of conversations with SMEs over the years where I make that kind of straightforward point of like, do we have to call it this? And they say, oh no, we have to call it that. Yeah, that's a requirement. And like, I'm pretty confident it doesn't say anywhere in the law what the name of the course has to be, but when you've been managing risk for a long time and the way you've always done it has worked and you've been able to survive in court, I totally understand that there's a little bit of a vested interest to not change things you don't have to change. Not like why expose us to a judge's interpretation of whether this counts or not. That's a hard conversation. And the other thing I would say is that the lazy comment, I get the feeling I sometimes feel too like all you did was take the guidance from the government and put it on slides, and like that's not relevant. But one thing I've noticed, I'll be transparent, at Georgia Tech, I always felt really busy and kind of stressed out. But in hindsight, I had the luxury of a good bit of time. Like I could really step back. It was higher education. We performed at a high level, but the pace, I think, was more manageable, and it allowed me just maybe that extra few hours early in projects to really stop and think about what are we trying to do here. And I'm new to my current job, so I think it'll get better. But I'm noticing right away that in a corporation where the needs change so quickly, and where everything we build, I find this is the biggest difference. Everything we build now has to be translated into 14 languages. So suddenly I feel like my job is like a full-time language translation project manager. And it's like a miracle if I can carve out some time to be proactive and really think about what the courses I'm trying to achieve. And I'm proud of what we're building, and they actually had a very mature program already, but it's much harder when you talk about that kind of scale and speed.
And look, I think that's a very fair observation, because I spent my whole life kind of, and I wish I could take these lenses off from time to time, but I am on the lookout for human risk wherever I find it, right? So I can be watching a movie, I can walk down the street, someone can tell me a story, and I'm like immediately thinking of all the human risk angles. And I feel like a bit like the kid in The Sixth Sense, right? I can see this stuff everywhere. And especially at the moment, it is everywhere. But so I recognize that bit. And of course, you're right. If you're in the heat of the moment, the easiest thing to do is just to keep doing what you have always done. And hey, because if you haven't been fired for doing it previously, it's a pretty defensible piece.
Yeah.
And you're right. So I understand how it happens. But on the other hand, I kind of think it's tragic, because it's sort of, it doesn't deliver what it delivers. And your point around standing in court, I think, is an interesting one, because people do go, well, we need to make sure that we're covered in the court of, whether it's a regulatory court or a legal court, we want to make sure that we're covered. And I'm not actually sure that the traditional approach to training does cover you off there. Because I think, if you had a slightly enlightened judge, they might sit there and go, let's watch this training that the individual went through.
Yes.
That we're here, that we need to discuss to understand how this incident happened. And your defense is he did or she did this training.
Yeah.
And then they would sit there and the judge would watch it and probably fall asleep.
Yeah.
And I suspect at the end of it, you'd sit there with a thing and somebody would just go, well, it's not really surprising they didn't do what you wanted, because this is not compelling either from a sort of engagement perspective or from a telling them what they need to do perspective. So I think it fails that test.
Yeah, this is why we get along. And I think that, there's some of the better regulation that's coming out now is obviously starting to see that. Like, there's still examples of laws that come out that just say, hey, managers have to have 8 hours of training on this subject a year. Like, a trainer, that's the stupidest place to start a training requirement from. Like, the only thing I can tell you that's irrelevant is how long the person spends in the course, right? What matters is what we're doing with the time that we have. But I was going to say, there's better regulation that's being written that says, like, you don't just have to have training. You have to have evidence-based best practices, or you have to be able to show that you have actually affected a key metric with your training, which is a very high bar. So basically, they're saying you've got to have good instructional designers and you've got to let them do their job. I think we're in a bit of a transition period, though, because, that does frankly take time, right? So the more we put into that to doing things well, quantity has to go down. So in some sense, in some corporations, I think they feel like, well, wait, you're telling me we can only have 2 courses this year instead of 4 courses. You just doubled my risk. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, but those 2 courses are going to be really effective, and we'll get to the other 2 courses next year, and overall we'll be better off. But it's we got to make sure that every aspect of this, the people writing the regulations, the judges interpreting the regulations, the lawyers are making arguments on either side, and the corporations all are on the same page. And I think we're living through a transition period right now, so it's kind of messy.
Right. And let's get into your sort of training philosophy. So how, if I sort of said to you, summarize your approach for somebody who's never come across it, how would you do that?
The basic approach is start with the audience and their needs. I wasn't sure how I was going to summarize it until I said it, but that's what I think. So you got to start with behavior in mind, not with content in mind. I can guarantee you that, there's a short little joke in the book that if you want to test the effectiveness of compliance training, just imagine this. Imagine a year from now, a colleague on your team is asked to do something that isn't right. Can you imagine with a straight face that person saying, I'm sorry, I can't do that. A required tutorial I took 1 year ago told me not to. There's no way that, especially if it was one of those bad old-fashioned tutorials, that is the thing that they remember in the moment of need, right? So, we've obviously got to do a lot more than just tutorials. I hope I can help create better tutorials that tell stories that do last with people a little bit longer because they're more engaging and they're more relevant. Jaws is an example of how that can be done. A lot of people are still afraid to get in the ocean after watching Jaws 20 years ago. So if you tell a really good story, it can linger. But the bar for that's high. I don't have Steven Spielberg's skills. So I think that the easier answer is to take away the silo around the learning management system and think of training much more broadly as sort of term interventions has gone out of vogue in my industry, but levers that you can pull in the employee's environment that change what they ultimately do.
Right. And I love the fact that you quote Jaws as an example, right? Because if you look at that movie, nobody in the movie learns anything.
No, that's true.
Because you have an absolutely reckless politician, right, who is not in control of what's going on, who, if you watch the sequel, gets reelected.
Yeah.
Right? So the irony, I love it because in the movie, no one learns anything at all. That's how you get the sequels, because they haven't solved the shark problem. And, the same technique, it's kind of, and yet that's a brilliant example, as you say, of something lost. So at least if no one in the movie learns anything, at least the rest of the world learns. But I think your point is kind of spot on, right? Which is to sort of say, what are we trying to achieve here?
Yeah.
And the answer is we want people to come away with something. Yeah. And that might be an awareness of a topic. It might even be just to highlight the fact that they need to think about something. And you don't necessarily have to give them the complete answer. You just have to make them aware they need to think about it and get help at the right point in time.
I'm so glad you said that, because when you mentioned Jaws, I wanted to come back to that point, which is like, it is possible to tell stories that really engage people and inspire them to do something different. And I think that's the power of storytelling. Everything about compliance training is almost designed to not have a story, because we want to be so clear, right? They want to say like, oh no, this is what to do and this is what not to do. We want to make it very clear, and we want to write a clear statement that is defensible. That is boring, right? The reason Jaws is scary, you don't even see the shark until 3/4 of the way through the film. It's all the uncertainty, the ambiguity, what's lurking below the water.
Right.
So it's another tip in the book, is just to try to keep your compliance in the gray area cases as much as possible, because people find that genuinely interesting. And if they're interested, they'll learn and they'll apply. And
that's fascinating. I mean, one of the things that I sort of saw a reasonable amount of was the kind of response to Me Too. Where you had companies running around going, oh man, we've got to make sure that we don't want any of this happening. And the way you solve that problem is you train people about what's acceptable and not acceptable. Mm-hmm. And so, I had to go on a course at a certain institution where it was, it was kind of like, here you go, here are some scenarios, and you have to tell us what you can and can't do. And they're not nuanced scenarios at all. It's kind of very primitive, sort of, is it okay to touch someone without their permission? Yes, no.
Yeah.
And then the bit I really loved was, it was like the pass mark was 6 out of 10.
Yeah.
And it's as if to say, right, 60% of the time you must behave like this, 40% of the time, don't worry about it, right? Just in the majority. And it was such a joke, because you go into this piece and you just, everybody knows what that training is for, which is, it is not to genuinely help you resolve a dilemma in the real world. No. It is about being able to say, everybody has done this training and they will now know not to be sex pests.
Yeah.
And my thought process was, it's terrible for a number of reasons, because first off, if you are a sex pest, this is not going to change your behavior. No. If you're not a sex pest, you're going to sit there and go, this is patronizing. And even worse, if you were a victim of a sex pest, right, you're going to sit there and go, they are not taking this at all seriously.
No.
And that's the worst of all, because those people are not looked after. And the signal from the organization is, we care more about our liability than we do you, the employee. And I think that message, you see coming across in all these bits of training, which is sort of, we have delivered the training, therefore job done, tick, in the same way that, we might have tried to do our homework as kids, get this over and done with. I'm not particularly engaged in the topic.
Yeah.
It's really astonishing how many companies spend millions, if not billions, if we look globally, on stuff that they know is useless, that is designed not for the purpose that they claim it's designed for. It's designed for a legal backside covering exercise rather than actually teaching someone something.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I mean, and the thing is, there's the sort of surface waste, right? Like, I'm spending however much money building this training, waste of money. I'm spending, an hour of every colleague globally's time, waste of productivity, right? That's easy to see. If the course is a check the box exercise, you've just wasted all that. I think even more insidious is the sort of downstream consequences of that these are probably, in a lot of corporations, the only global message that ever gets distributed. Like, it's very true at Georgia Tech, where I was before. The only thing that I could guarantee you every single person at Georgia Tech saw was the annual compliance campaign, because it is the only thing we enforced. And some people probably checked the website. Some people might have looked at emails. But the only thing I can tell you that everybody saw was that compliance campaign. If that is a cynical check the box exercise that leaves people thinking that's how much my company really cares about this, that just made your company worse. And I would argue probably increased your chances of various kinds of risk in the future. Whereas opposed to, if you get this message right, you're building morale, you're reducing turnover, and hopefully you're actually reducing the risk of sexual harassment. that's a great example of one where there's evidence that tells you what you should do if you really want to reduce sexual harassment. The only kind of training that's been proven to be effective is bystander intervention training, because people already know what's sexual harassment, and a lot of people want to stop it, but it's not as easy as it sounds. And if you can sort of say, like, what would you do in this situation? I don't know. I knew I wouldn't harass somebody, but would I say something in that case? That's kind of tricky. That person's my manager. Did they know it was wrong? Now we're talking about something thought-provoking, something where maybe I would actually be grateful for some tools that would help me feel more comfortable in the future. So perfect example.
Right. And I mean, one of the things that when you look at sort of traditional approaches to training, and the way it's delivered feels completely at odds. It becomes this sort of separate exercise, and it's almost like a kind of, oh God, here we go. And people approach it with the same amount of joy as they approach, anything involving the tax authorities or any other. It kind of comes along, and it's this clunky as hell thing that is just not engaging. And the bit I find astonishing is sort of that is deemed to be okay and acceptable. And yet even the people that put it together kind of know what they're putting together. Yeah. And, I've been lucky in the last several places I've worked that my last job, it was just one person, that the director of our learning department refused to put out anything she wasn't proud of. And she was very comfortable saying no. So if people came and said, hey, we need this training, she'd say, it doesn't make any sense to me. I don't think people will like it. And they say, no, we need it. She'd just say, no, fine. If you got a budget, go pay somebody else to do it, but we're not going to do it. Right. So right. I was very lucky to have that. I'm not that good at saying no. So I needed that support. Then my current job, I work on a compliance team, but they're very passionate about not wasting people's time. Every time I suggest something, they say, yep, let's do that. Let's try it. It sounds like it might move the needle. And again, I think there's a ton of, interestingly, I thought I was writing the book for instructional designers who I thought were like being burdened with this compliance training. And I was just trying to give them some tools to work with their SME to try to make it a little bit better. I think actually the learning community has hopefully kind of enjoyed the book, but where I've got the most feedback is the compliance community. Like, I think a lot of compliance professionals see this training as maybe being the weakest link in their chain. Like they know what they want training to be, and they know it's not really been there in the past. Right. I think we're getting there. But it's, you put it in those terms, and it does make sense to sort of say, if you were deploying a new technology, before you deployed it, you would try and understand what that technology can do, the limitations. And it's strange in training that somebody who's commissioning training doesn't spend a little bit of time understanding the art of the possible.
Yes.
And going, what could this do? What do you think is effective in this space? And what should we avoid doing?
Yeah.
And you wouldn't commission any other form of sort of service or technology without kind of having a little bit of understanding around that piece.
Yeah.
And yet training seems to fall through the cracks a little bit.
Yeah, perfectly said. People, sometimes I tell them I'm an instructional designer. That's what I have my master's degree in, is what I used to do. And they say, that's a profession? What is that? I say, you design instruction. It's like, wow, I have no idea that could exist. That's an interesting thing. And I in the book, I dwell on this one idea. There's some underlying assumptions about compliance training that we've got to address. We can't just try to fix the surface. We got to see why it's the way it is. And I think we have to acknowledge, whether people are prepared to admit it or not, I think a lot of people don't think training can make a difference, or at least e-learning. They don't think e-learning tutorials can make a difference. I think that's not a product of what e-learning can do. It's a product of what e-learning's done in the past, because we've given it a bad message to deliver. So you get a lot of people who are saying, like, yeah, sure, Travis, what you're saying would probably make a slightly better course, but I don't have all day and my budget is limited. So just check this box, right. We'll move on. And I think if they could see the results, and that's what we found at Georgia Tech. We set out, the first time we redesigned the annual compliance campaign, we had just one metric in mind. We designed our entire approach around moving that metric. We made a huge impact on that metric, like bigger than I expected to be frank. And when people saw that, they started asking us for more of that kind of training, because people don't know what they want until they see it.
And of course, one of the challenges with compliance as a whole, but also the training piece, is you kind of know when it hasn't landed, right? Because something goes wrong.
Yeah.
And I had this as a regulator, right? So people go, what is the point in having a regulator? And you go, useless. When you do the right thing, no one notices, right? It's when it goes wrong, you get hammered because people spot that. And so you're sort of constantly trying to prove a negative.
Yeah.
And I think that's a challenge for a compliance function, which is sort of, if the compliance objectives haven't been delivered, we can shoot the compliance function. But when they are, no one notices. And of course, the most effective time compliance functions are the ones that remain invisible, right? Doesn't feel clunky, doesn't feel obtrusive, and yet the outcome is the one that you're looking for. And training, I think, is an interesting piece that sits in that space where, we can identify a piece of training that's gone hideously wrong because no one paid any attention to it. But how do we, I'm intrigued by the bit you talk about positive metrics. I mean, how do we know we've been successful?
Yeah, well, when I talk about a behavioral approach to compliance training, if we're really going to do it right, it has to start with a metric. Like if you don't know what behavior you're trying to change, if you don't know how you would even know if you changed it, then what's the point? Like, you wouldn't build a bridge saying like, well, what do you want it to connect? I'm not really sure, but build me a bridge.
But I believe I have succeeded.
That's right. That's right. But I mean, now I'm willing to admit it's not always that easy, and it requires a lot of creativity. And what I found is that often it'll send you back to the same metric you tried to influence last time. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because I think we need to keep a focus on what we can change and what we want to change until we change it, and then new things will reveal themselves to change. So that might sound like very abstract. So I'll tell you practically, when we redesigned the annual compliance campaign, I asked everybody in the room, I said, what could I do that would make you feel more comfortable with the amount of risk at Georgia Tech? Everybody in that room said, we want people to use the reporting mechanisms more. Like, every time something goes wrong, we find out about it. There were 10 people that knew that didn't tell us. And if they would have told us sooner, we could have acted sooner. And if we could get that numbers up, we would be much better off. And so we just said, let's do that. So we kind of built one tutorial that was called The Science of Standing Up. We framed it, because it's an engineering school, so we framed it with sort of a lot of scientific studies about, why do people not speak up when they see something wrong, like bystander syndrome, why do people sometimes not act? What are some tools that the airline industry and the medical industry, where stakes are so high, have put in place that allow people to speak up, which isn't always a natural instinct? How can you apply those skills? And then we reinforce that message a lot in different ways before and after. And we saw just a huge spike in the number of reports. So much so that we were kind of on the front page for a little bit more often than we would like to be for a few months there, because things came to light. But when the things came to light, they were able to be addressed, no permanent ramifications. They've got a very healthy program there. It's in fantastic hands. Ling Lee started right after I left. I wish I could have worked with her more. But I think that it's all, when we knew what we wanted to do, we could do it.
Right. And so it's literally about having a singular, or I guess you can have a few, but not too many, specific objectives that you want to deliver. And of course, the majority of training doesn't start with that premise at all. It starts with compliance training. We will start with the legislation or the regulation that we want to have communicated to people.
Yeah.
And so it begins with that frame, which I always refer to as organizationally convenient, right? Because it's the organization that's trying to tick its box. So we will make sure that we've dealt with our piece, and we can, and the best way to make sure that everybody understands this law is that we teach things through the lens of the law.
Yeah.
And as I look at these, I always find it quite funny, because you go, well, that law sits alongside about a million other things people have to be thinking about. And they don't look at the world through that particular lens. They look at the lens through the activities that they are trying to do.
Yeah.
Not through the framework that somebody else has created to mitigate the risks that are inherent in that thing.
Perfect.
And so I think that's a really interesting articulation there, where you're saying, okay, so what I've got is I've got a behavioral objective in mind, and I'm focusing my training around that behavioral objective, rather than focusing around the thing that should sit on a bookshelf somewhere and never darken anyone apart from the policy geek's door.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think we can get creative with our metrics too. One thing I've been talking to our leadership about is that if we're doing this right over the years, we should see turnover go down. We should see the performances on culture surveys go up. Like, we should be designing our programs in a way that affects some of the larger metrics that are already being tracked. And then there's an easy one too that I think I fully defend, and that's traffic to the resources that you put out there to try to help people make better choices. So one of the really cool things that Tech Data has are these adaptive decision-making tools. So instead of like a policy that's just a PDF, it's a tool that asks you questions and says, okay, you've got a gift. Tell me about the gift. And by the time you answer about 5 or 6 questions, it tells you whether the gift is allowable or not. It was there before I got there. It's really cool. One thing I'd really like to do in the future is make sure that our training is really focused on driving the use of those tools, because we know that will translate to buy-in, which will probably translate to behavior, and we can track how often those tools are used. We might not be able to guarantee that they're always following through, but I feel like we can make a pretty strong case that this tool is built to help them make better choices. the use of the tool is up 100%, I think they're making better choices.
Right. That, of course, requires you to have tools that are helpful to the end user. Because there's a flip side to what you just said, right? Which is the training was so bad that they all had to go look up the answer elsewhere.
That's true.
And they used our traditional library of regulation to go find the answer that they wanted. And so I caveat slightly with that thing of saying that only works if the tool that's used is a proper problem solving tool, i.e. it is designed around the user's needs rather than being designed around the organization's needs. But I love that idea of sort of going, well, actually what we'll do is we'll assess the quality of this by how engaged they are.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Not can they rattle off what the rules say, but actually do they have enough of an understanding to recognize when they need help?
Yeah. Yeah. One of my favorite statistics ever, we asked people during one course to go visit this website that was a very useful website, in my opinion. How many times people clicked the link was interesting. I was really interested by how many people, because you can track this, how many people then click to another subpage within the site. So that like click through. That shows, that shows they're really engaging with the material. And, you can see unique site visits. So a lot of these people had never been to the site before, and they lingered on it long enough to explore and click a few tabs. That's probably shows they're spending more time thinking about that subject than they have maybe all year, which should translate to behavior. And ideally, we get to a world where I wouldn't have to use these second order metrics, and we could actually show, look, sexual harassment is down and the amount of impermissible is down. But we all know it's a high bar. Big data will make some of this stuff easier. Some of this stuff is always going to exist in the shadows. So we still have to trust to some extent. But I think we can be a lot more evidence informed and know if we know what metric we're trying to move. Like maybe you want reports to go up, design a training program around that. Or maybe, you've got a robust reporting culture and you're designing a new training around your most prevalent issue. Then I think it's fair to expect reports to go down because, people were already reporting and you're trying to fix a problem, reports should go down. So you gotta know exactly where you are and what you're trying to achieve, and then hopefully you can achieve it.
One of the other things I've seen quite a lot of is very standardized approach to training. So first thing is everybody must do the training. And obviously if the more people that are required to do the training, the less relevant by default it's going to be to them, because general training equals very low level of transmitted information because it has to be broad to cover the general piece. So you've got that sort of everybody will have done this. You've then got the kind of everybody will have spent this much time on it because we can demonstrate quality of training through the amount of time. And there's a whole host of other sort of standardized pieces that really suggest we're pushing everybody through the same educational funnel, and that feels good. Yeah. Whereas, of course, we know in reality that education, there are some classes where certain kids don't need help at all because they just get it.
Right.
And there are other kids who have a real problem with that particular subject and need special. And we don't think about any of those particular dynamics. And I find it interesting, this one size fits all approach, presupposing that everybody poses the equal amount of risk in regard to a particular topic, I think is really, it's lazy, but it gets really bad outcomes.
Yeah, I'm with you completely. I deal in cliches and bad jokes. So if you'll forgive me for another one, I think one size fits all is just another way of saying fits nobody. Right.
Right. There's an interesting piece actually. So I was talking to someone today around sort of this idea of the average person, and we sort of often make assessments around the average, but actually in many cases the average person doesn't exist.
Yeah.
It's literally an average, and therefore that doesn't mean it applies to anyone. So you can miss the boat completely.
Yeah.
Because, with a particular topic, if you've got the people that know that ignore it because they know, there's the people that don't know who are bored by what you're telling them and so switch it. So you can, if you go for that average, the average person may not actually exist anywhere.
Yeah. I agree with you completely. And I think the challenge, definitely, if you asked any trainer, instructional designer, they'd say the number one thing you have to do is know your audience, tailor your content to your audience, because that's the number one thing. It has to be relevant, and you can't be relevant to everybody. Again, I'm a pragmatist. That's one of the reasons I'm attracted to this field, because there's a lot of challenges with trying to make good training in this field. And one of them is that we have to do this compliance stuff at scale, which is why it goes to e-learning in the first place, because they'd rather catch too broad of a net and make sure they catch that person who might make a mistake than try to cast a narrow net and exclude people. And due to limitations in our HR systems, I can't be really confident that, Tim could have an antitrust violation and Tom couldn't. It's very hard. So, but I said, we've got to try. So, I'm getting my understanding of tech data ramped up quickly from the leaders that I'm learning from there. And one thing we've already done is exclude certain people from our big campaigns. So like there are definitely certain groups that were in the past getting some of this big training because we just said, well, everybody has to have it. And we've been able to exclude like 2,000 people that we can confidently say this person will never be presented with an antitrust issue. You know, they're
right.
boxes in a warehouse. It doesn't make any sense. So like, they'll probably have lots of complicated problems, you know, in the workplace, but not that one. So so that's the first step: is exclude whoever you can exclude, save a little bit of time, and send a positive message that you're trying. Over years, months even, you can maybe add to those exclusions. If a business leader can make a good case that, hey, you know, you included my group, but they don't have anything to do with this, talk to them about it. If you're sure that's true, exclude that group too. But that's only like clearing the ground for the more important phase, which is eventually we've got this broad foundation that sort of meets our core compliance requirements, whatever they are. We get that to where it's sustainable. And then we start doing really targeted, good training for very small audiences. Like, what do project managers need to know? What does a salesperson need to know? What does a manager of a team need to know? Even that's too vague. What does a manager and a sales team need to know versus what does a manager in IT need to know? And so we're that's where we want to get to. It takes a lot of investment and a lot of time. So you know, we got a pretty
right, but it's interesting because if you look at digital interventions, so you've got the scalability piece, but you've also got the bespoke customer piece, and we all know. Let's take something like Facebook, right, where they use algorithms to work out what to put in front of me. Even if you and I had exactly the same friends, right, we would still see different. Our personal experience of Facebook would be very different.
Yeah,
and there's a reason those things are super addictive, and you've got the whole kind of Cambridge Analytica scandal and all sorts of challenges, right? Because it works.
Yeah,
and I think this sort of this opportunity to narrowcast in the digital world, I think, is really important. And, even just personalizing the training to the extent that your name appears not in a kind of crass way, but you could personalize it according to different attributes.
Yeah.
That for me seems to be the future of this thing that really says, let's use the fact that digital allows personalization and customization to drive an experience that is much more powerful than you would do by, the first forms of e-learning were literally filmed lectures.
Yeah.
You might have put cartoon characters, but bottom line was it was a kind of broadcast model. And we've got this kind of narrow casting, dedicated piece that I think we can now start to do.
Yeah.
And that then starts to get really interesting because you can speak to the people in a way that works for them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The sort of next generation learning management systems are doing some really amazing things where, people get the learning they need to get. Maybe it's 5 minutes one day, it's 20 minutes the next day. It's based on their responses to questions. It's based on their role, so they can build. This is training that people that had your role before found helpful. In the compliance space, though, I feel like the first step is we need better content, because those LMSs, basically what they're doing is they're giving you chunks of content. We don't have those chunks of relevant content yet. So we kind of need to build that first, start thinking about training in terms of chunks of useful information. And then we can start thinking of algorithms and things to get those chunks in the right hands. But there are easy things we can do right away. So I try to be, like I say, an optimistic pragmatist. So right away, easy fix for your listeners. If you have a course with 3 scenarios in it, I can make that course better immediately. Put a menu before the scenarios that tells the learner, there's 3 scenarios in this course. Choose the one that sounds most relevant to you. You've already built the scenarios. They're already there. Your 20-minute course will become a 10-minute course, which is way more effective. And the person will have chosen the scenario they think they want to watch, which shows their buy-in, which shows they'll pay more attention, so they'll get the content more relevant to them. I can't imagine a regulator in the world who would say, but you let them see scenario 2 and 3. They're still going to see the other, like the framing content around it. They're still going to attest to the policy. You're going to say, I let them focus on the scenario that seems most relevant to them because that's behavior-based learning. And, it's an easy win. You don't even have to add in new content. You just have menus.
And actually, what's really interesting about that is you've suddenly got a feedback loop.
Yes.
Okay. Which is if everybody goes for scenario 3 and nobody is interested in scenario 1, that potentially tells you that either scenario 1 is utterly irrelevant, or actually they can't see what the relevance of it. So you've mispresented it. But either way, it's not landing with the audience. And I think that sense of agency is key. I mean, I always tell the story about, if you have kids and you want them to wear a coat, do not tell them they have to wear a coat, because even if they were going to, they will rebel.
Yes.
Right? Because nobody likes being told what to do. So the way you solve that problem is you say, obviously, you're going to have to wear a coat. Which coat would you like to wear? And magically, they think because they've chosen a coat that they're in control. And they're not. But you've just And I think that's a lovely sort of a way of thinking about it, which is there is no sense of agency in a lot of compliance training. It lands in your email inbox or on your screen, and you are kind of there like a lamb to the slaughter, listening to this stuff, and you go, oh God, here we go. And you're right, there is no sense, and it comes at a time of someone else's choosing. So it's the anti-Netflix, right? Which is literally, imagine you were sat in front of your TV and the TV turned on and Netflix goes, right now, you are going to have to watch this.
Yeah.
And you go, but I hate that. I don't care. You will watch this now because and I think that sense of agency and control around it.
Yeah.
The more you can give people a sense that they're selecting their own adventure.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's super powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. In my current, I think in the compliance space, I much prefer the communications side of my job now to the training side of my job, even though I'm a really passionate trainer, because the communication side, there's already the precedent that you can do that kind of thing. Like, I'm going to put some stuff out there that I think people will find interesting. I'm not going to force them to watch it all. I'm going to bring it to their attention, and I'm confident that it's interesting enough that they'll look at it. We just launched this new Real Tales of Ethics and Compliance series, which are like stories of real things that have gone wrong, and we publicized it, and there's 2 volumes out there already. Eventually it'll be a website with like 20 volumes. I don't care if people look at 1 or 10 or 5, I want them to look at what they want to look at. And it'll be much more effective than the hour-long course that they sit through that we won't let them click next until they've seen the whole slide. That's one that bothers me. That's one where I go back and forth myself, because almost every SME I've ever worked with says restrict the next button until they've seen the whole video or until they've listened and seen all the tabs. And I know that that's insulting to an adult, and instructional design best practice would say that, that's terrible. Like, people read at their own pace, they digest at their own pace, let them move through the course and dwell on what they find interesting. On the other hand, because the compliance brand was historically so bad, I do know that if we turned the next button on, a lot of people would just click, because they don't expect it to be interesting. So it's another one of those chicken and the egg situations where we kind of have to win back their trust before we can trust them. It's a bit challenging.
But I mean, it is deeply frustrating. I mean, I'm very much in the camp of saying, if you piss me off, and you put me through an experience that under any other circumstance I would find annoying.
Yeah.
So if Amazon decided to do that, right, go completely the opposite thing and go, instead of 1 click purchasing, right, it would be 50 click purchasing, right? And we'll deliberately put the extra things in, and we'll stop you clicking that thing. We'll make you sit and wait to check out.
Yeah.
Right? You'd be furious. In the same way that I walk into a physical store, if there's a big line, I'm going to walk out.
Yeah.
Right? And what I think is really interesting is if you take the context in which much training and communications is presented, if you were to shift that context to somewhere else, people wouldn't put up with it for a second.
No.
Right. No. You wouldn't, if you phoned up a sort of call center and you asked for help for something and they were like, I will send you the manual and you can read this yourself. That is not acceptable.
Yeah.
And yet somehow we shift this thing and we forget about these other contexts. We kind of go, in this situation, we will do this.
Yeah.
And don't think about what frame of mind is that putting people in. And I did a webinar recently with Ricardo from Broadcat around, we were looking at sort of what priorities should compliance people have in the current environment. And one of the things, we looked at things like attestations.
Oh, yeah.
And said, a lot of firms require you to sign an attestation, say you've read the rules and, you've complied with all of them. And you're kind of looking at this ridiculous exercise because, frankly, you're asking me to sign something to keep my job.
Yeah.
And you're not really giving me an out if I haven't read this stuff.
Yeah.
Right? So there is no opportunity for me to go, actually, I haven't. And I don't really, can I get some help? It's a choice of you either perjure yourself or you do it. You have no choice, right? You go down and then we rely on that as a demonstration. And so we were talking and just going, when else does that happen? And the answer is, if you go and rent a car, right? You go to the airport,
True.
You rent a car. What happens is you turn up there, you're required to sign a whole load of crap. You have no choice.
Yeah.
Right. And car rental, we know, is a massively antagonistic situation.
Yeah.
Because you're there, they don't trust you, and you don't trust them, right? You are waiting to get screwed over by these people, which is why you have that ridiculous process of let's go and see what scratches there are in the vehicle, check the state of the vehicle before, because nobody trusts anybody else.
No.
And so I love it because you say that's the frame of reference we have for this sort of exercise.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yet we think it's okay.
Yeah.
To put you in the same frame of mind internally, doing something that is an attestation piece. And I'm pretty sure that training is the same thing where we've all been in, and airline safety briefings used to be one of those things where they were dull as hell. Mm-hmm. And you kind of, we have to go through this process and we go. And so I think there are lots of frames of reference for some of the things that we ask people to do internally that will subliminally trigger memories. And whether it's a school you're going back to school, or whether it's a particularly unpleasant customer service experience, or just something in the real world as opposed to the work world, where we're kind of unleashing dynamics from unpleasant situations that nobody enjoys and somehow expecting them to be marvelous. So it's sort of, we've all been forced to sit through dull things before to be able to get what we want. Sort of we have this as kids, right? You will do your homework and then you can have some cookies. Yeah. Type bribery situation. And you sort of accept that. But we kind of know that that's not necessarily the best way of engaging your kids. And yet we do it to adults in training. Sit through this training course.
Yeah. Yeah. Couldn't agree with you more. Yeah, I think that I've seen both sides of the spectrum. There's been some trainings that I've like personally worked really hard on and I was really proud of and I was confident were good. And I got sort of angry emails back from powerful people saying basically, how dare you think I should take this? I've been doing this job for 30 years. I won't say which companies I was at when that happened. Not my current company, but that's happened. But then I've also seen the other side of the spectrum where somebody will tell me like, oh, yeah, I had to sit through that course like 4 times because it didn't track my completion the first 3 times. Can you tell me if it got confirmed? And I'll send them a back. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, it did. And they say, oh, no worries. Have a nice day. And I think you have a right to be furious with me. Right. Already a waste of your time, that particular course in this previous life. And now you had to sit through it 4 times. Like, you're going to accept this. I can't believe it. So I think that, we it's kind of, we've all sort of held our nose for a while and said, yeah, this is just one of those things we have to do. But it's only one of those things we have to do because we've said we have to do it, And I don't want to talk myself out of a job. I'm really excited about working in the compliance space. But my whole argument is that we could be doing so many more proactive, interesting things if we didn't all feel compelled to do these boring check the box things just because it's always been done that way.
Right. Yeah. Right. And it's funny because you made a really good point earlier, I thought, which is the audience expectations. Mm-hmm. They come in going, I'm enforced to do this. This is going to be dull. Yeah. And we come in and go, they're not engaged. So we can't trust them and so you have this kind of vicious cycle that requires both sides to shift the piece. But I think the sort of, if you like, the compliance has to make the first move, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because in this dance, we're just going to be stuck in a kind of standoff where we've got to kind of you have to sort of shift it somehow, and I think you're never going to get that level of engagement if you're constantly treating people in the way that you've always treated.
And in one way it feels like daunting and overwhelming to think like you look at your LMS and it's full of 50 compliance courses and you don't think any of them are that good, and it feels like, well, how am I ever going to fix this problem? Meanwhile, like I still have to have this stuff. So in the book, I talk a lot about the idea of like a virtuous cycle. We're not going to fix it overnight, but one win can go a long way really quickly. So I'd say like to instructional designers, I always say, find your right team, right? Find the subject matter expert who believes in this stuff. The ones who don't, keep putting out their 30 sides of content because you're fighting a losing battle there. Free up more of your time to go work with that person who sees the value of this stuff. Build a really great course, brand it so that people see it's something different. Maybe put it somewhere so it feels like something different, follow through on it, make the most of it. And that will lead to more requests from other like-minded people to build similar great stuff. And that's what I say. I'm really fortunate to have been on 2 really good teams in a row that want good stuff. And that's really all it takes because you can start building good stuff and it gets easier and easier and the people trust you more and they come into the next course not rolling their eyes, clicking through, but I wonder what this is going to be about. They don't have to say I'm going to love it. If they're just thinking, I wonder what this is going to be about, that's a huge win, right?
Yeah. There's always a point where you go, if somebody loves compliance training, then because it's not entertainment.
No.
And I think there's this interesting piece where people go, let's take something really dull, and we'll make it exciting because we'll turn it into a game or we'll have a cartoon, right? And I agree, those things can make high quality content significantly better, no question. But if your content is terrible, kind of funkifying it somehow, it's not a winning strategy.
No,
because it's almost like it's like a very disappointing breakfast cereal where you just change the box, right? And the box looks really interesting, so people buy it, and then they open the box and go, it is still this godforsaken sugar fest of hell. You've just changed the packaging, not the actual the content.
I've gone through that I'm still, I'm not going to say I'm cured, but I think a lot of instructional designers, we own a stake in this because we like fixing things. We like building things. We like making movies. So, a lot of us see the challenge of 30 sides of content as, oh man, how am I going to make this into 5 funny videos? videos. There's ways to do that. You do parodies, you make animated things, but
Right.
I'll be transparent. The most recent course we just rolled out at Tech Data is not my favorite course I've ever built from like a razzle dazzle perspective. It's very there's video in it and there's interactions in it, but it's pretty, the style of it is pretty straightforward. But I'm much more proud of it than I am some of my earlier courses that had more fancy production value, because it's really straightforward. It's 3 modules. Each starts with a story of something that could easily happen at Tech Data and a takeaway. Like, if you don't want this to happen to you, do this. And the next module is the same thing. The next module is the same thing. And having that structure, it takes just as much time to build as the fancy one, because you got to have a lot more conversations in the analysis stage. But I feel like it's a lot more useful to the people that are consuming.
I'll obviously put links in the show notes to the book, Fully Compliant, which is highly recommended. And I never thought that if you'd asked me, would I be doing a podcast with someone that's written a book on compliance training and raving about it, I would never have thought that was going to happen. But you have proven my historic me wrong, and it is a fascinating read. So sort of, if people like the thoughts that you the way you're thinking, what do you have to lose given the battle of it? You might as well read this thing and see if you can kind of pick some tips and pick up. But what I wanted to do is to just close out by picking your brain on, if we look at what's going on at the moment.
Yes.
To turn to the big coronavirus topic. There's an interesting thing here, which is communication and training is going on a massive scale.
Yes.
And so we're seeing lots of examples of governments doing what kind of compliance functions need to do within organizations, but on, populations.
Yeah.
And I wonder what your thoughts were around, one, stuff that you've seen that you like or don't like, and in terms of effectiveness. And then the second bit is whether you think this is going to change. Is this game changing in terms of the way people perceive that? Do you think there's a broader recognition about this stuff, or is it just actually, that we're just training geeks and we love it?
No, I mean, I'm fascinated by it, right? I keep telling people, does COVID make you think of compliance at all? And people give
yeah, it does. They're both thoroughly unpleasant experiences that I don't enjoy, and I'm sick to death of them, and I wish they'd both go away.
Right? Yeah. I mean, but it's this massive scale exercise, or something organizations have been wrestling with for a long time. Is you can protect people if you put more regulations and safeguards in place, but at the same time, those regulations and safeguards impede people. So it's this balance between, like, what's our obligation to make sure as few bad things happen as possible, versus how do we know if the things we're doing are becoming so stringent that we're undercutting our business or undercutting our life. I think that's an interesting aspect. But to your real question, I think one of the most effective communications campaigns of all time was "Don't Mess with Texas." I don't know if you read this part in the book. So "Don't Mess with Texas" was designed to stop littering in Texas. Hugely effective. Apparently, people in Texas were really bad at littering. They threw their trash everywhere, and the highways were awash with trash in the 1970s and into the 80s. They launched the "Don't Mess with Texas" campaign, which wasn't just the tagline, but it was a series of communications and extra trash cans stranded along the road, and it was very, very effective. So I think a tagline can go along the way. So what I'm noticing mostly is taglines. And I live in the UK now, and I can tell they're sort of experimenting with different taglines. I've seen several different versions that pop up on the TV a lot. But I mean, "Stay home, save lives." Hard to argue with that. The clarity of it's very strong. It rolls off the tongue. "Stay home, save lives." Protect the NHS is something you see a lot. They already knew the NHS is this crazy popular institution here in England. That message really resonates, I think, with people more than protect yourself, protect your kid. Protect the NHS. People hear that and it sticks with them. And I saw a really cool advert last night on the TV, that another one just sort of telling us to stay in, And it said, I think it said, "Now we're apart, soon we'll be together." And definitely had the look of a tagline that I'm sure they're going to reuse again. But, I found that somebody who's, occasionally, like everybody else, I'm sure, felt a little stir crazy, a little like unmoored by the current situation. That tagline had a bit of a soothing effect on me. It felt like this is somebody who's really thinking about this content, feels relevant and interesting. And you're right. And so I think the right words go a long way. And I'm a sucker for taglines. I'll workshop 30 taglines for a code or for a new training course. I think they might only remember that one sentence, but if it's the right one sentence, it might seem like I'm overthinking it, but I think it can make a difference.
Right, and I agree, and it's sort of particularly now where we think about what we're being asked to do in most cases is super punitive. There will be some introverts that love this stuff, right?
Yeah.
Everybody else is being forced to stay at home. This is awesome. But for the vast majority of people, this is a pain in the butt.
Yeah.
And even when we recognize the health challenges and we sort of understand the logic, right, that still doesn't make it a pleasant experience. And yet we're sort of, I think it's really interesting to see the levels of civil disobedience.
Yes. Yeah.
Are pretty low.
Yeah.
And sure, the press always fixate on, here's a miscreant doing something.
Yeah.
And there are some dumbasses out there doing some idiotic things. But broadly speaking, the average, and I think that's a really interesting proxy for compliance training, where you sort of go, look, we can't shoot for 100% of every compliance with every single rule all of the time by every single person. No. Absolutely impossible. So what we need to do is get the majority of people doing it. There'll be some things you don't want anyone doing under any circumstances, at which point, right, build controls around those to make sure that. But when it's the average compliance ask is kind of like, let's get as many people as we can to be doing the right thing, thinking about the right thing, and having a better awareness than they would have done without whatever our intervention was. And I think if we look at what's going on at the moment, broadly speaking, there has been a heck of a lot of goodwill there. Now, there is a terrifying monster out there that if people think about it, they sort of understand. But I think, there's an interesting example of a massive, massive attempt to co-opt a population to doing something that doesn't come naturally and isn't fun.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when you talk about, human risk, we talk about behavior. The interesting thing about human beings is we can do almost anything we want to do, really. Like a lot of times you look at something, an engineering problem, a compliance problem, you think, well, I'm never going to get people to stop doing that. But you could, of course, like how much energy and effort it would take depends on the thing and how attached they are to doing the thing. But you're right. This is proven that people are willing to change very large habits if they believe in the mission, which can certainly have I think then it just becomes really incumbent on us as compliance professionals to make sure we're always choosing the right mission. We can't ask people to change 100 behaviors because the world will be slightly better. But if we really see a real need, then we focus on that need. And if people believe in it, they'll change.
I think that is a fantastic note on which to finish. So as I said before, I'll put details of the book in the show notes. And look, I would love to have you come back actually and talk again about this, because I think as you go through your own adventures, there are going to be things that, occur to you. And I'd love to pick your brains later on when you're further down the road around these pieces. And what I'd love people to do is to kind of share with us any, if you've come across great bits of compliance training or great things you've seen out there, feel free to share that. You can send it to me via the human risk thing, because I think one of the challenges when people face this topic is they understand the theory, but actually if you can show it being done, that's incredibly powerful. So I want to also try and help people, not just in terms of barking theory at them, but go, here's a good way to look at it. So if people come across things, maybe they can share that with us and we can help spread the word around that. Because if you can see it in action, then I think that's a very powerful message. All of that said, I do highly recommend the book. As I say, if you told me I was recommending a book on compliance training, then a year or so ago I wouldn't have believed you, but I genuinely am.
If you told me I'd written a book on compliance training, I wouldn't have believed you.
Right, yeah. Well, no, I always have this thing where saying nobody grows up wanting to be a compliance officer, and I can now add to the list. Nobody grows up wanting to write a book on compliance training, or indeed do a podcast on it. But here we are, and there's a lesson about life's rich tapestry.
And I thoroughly enjoyed it. So thank you.
Jairus, thank you so much for, one, writing the book, because I think it's really, really useful thing to have done. But secondly, for appearing on the podcast and being such great value. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks very much.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My massive thanks to Travis for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about his book, Fully Compliant, take a look at the show notes. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You'll find episodes of it and the ability to subscribe on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you're not already subscribed to the Human Risk newsletter, you'll find details of that and the Human Risk YouTube channel in the show notes. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this podcast, but in the meantime, stay safe and thanks again for listening.